Welcome to Monet Cafe Studio. I'm artist Susan Jenkins. Did you know you can sketch in a sketchbook with soft pastels? In today's tutorial, I think you will be amazed as I share tips and techniques I've learned over the years to take my pastel painting on the go and capture some of life's beautiful moments by doing some pastel journaling in this way. This lesson is not only great for a beginner artist with affordable products and easy techniques, it's great for pastel artists of every level. Let's begin by exploring some of the sketchbooks that I've used over the years, and I'll explain why I like some of them more than others. These are little ones that have a glue binding at the top. I actually prefer sketchbooks that have a ring binding, and I'll talk more about that reasoning in a minute. I use sketchbooks of different sizes and shapes, even watercolor paper, which will be the lesson that we're doing today. Well, yes, we'll be combining a little bit of watercolor with soft pastel. And years ago, I would only sketch in my sketchbooks with maybe some charcoal and didn't really consider soft pastels as an option. But often in life, we're forced to learn new things when a trial or a tragedy hits. And our home totally flooded 6 years ago, and I didn't have a studio to work in. For a while, my family and I lived in a travel trailer, so I started using pastels to sketch in sketchbooks, and lots of my techniques really worked. So I'm excited to share those with you today. This is one of the watercolor sketchbooks I used when we were a little bit homeless for a while, and that's why I don't have the tracing paper between the sheets. But this was a technique that I discovered where I laid down watercolor first and then applied soft pastel on top. It worked great, and I continue to use it to this day. I love using this very affordable technique, and that's what I'm going to teach you right now. I'll be using a Canson watercolor pad, very affordable. It's a 9x12 size, and we need a reference photo. I was very blessed recently to discover with my husband a beautiful field of sunflowers and zinnias. I took tons of reference images that are all available to my patrons, if you're a patron of mine, on my Patreon page, and I chose 2 of them today to journal this memory and this moment. You can use whatever watercolors you have, but I'm using a very affordable set made by Lang. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I'll have all the product links in the description of this video, just so you know. Now, I love to do a color chart when using watercolors. They appear so much more luminous and bright when you apply them with water on the paper. So fortunately, this watercolor set came with one, and I really love these colors. For the price, it's really great. They even have these metallic colors. How cool is that? The pastels I'll be using for this lesson are almost entirely from this Prismacolor NuPastels 96 set. Now, they do make smaller sets in 24 and other multiples, but I find these pastels are great for working on regular paper. They're a little bit harder and they apply well. Another product, one more product I'm adding to this. I'm just going to show you a trick using this acrylic ink. It's a great way to get darks in your pastel paintings. I used to always love this color, which is called Purple Lake, to get a good dark, but I recently discovered the one that was in my left hand called Indigo. It's great. You're going to see me use them right now. I use various brushes, fan brushes. For this technique, I'm going to show you various sizes. And I just want to mention all of these brushes are really cheap. I think I got some of them at Walmart. And for underpaintings that I'm going to show you here, sometimes it's better to have a brush that has a little bit of character. I think you'll see why in just a minute. And as I always say, use what you have. So let me show you a neat way to get some darks in your pastel painting and watercolor painting by using these acrylic inks. I'm just going to make a mark of this indigo color and scribble in a little bit of it to suggest a tree line in the distance. And then I'm going to use my brush and a little bit of water to create a nice, subtle, and subdued line of trees. And what I'm doing here is I just have a little bit of water on my brush, and I control the water by just dabbing it on the paper towel. But this is a way to get in some really good darks to begin a painting if you're starting with watercolor. You might know that watercolor, you can't really get good darks unless you just layer a lot of thick watercolor down. So using an acrylic ink like this is really a great way to get in some of your trees and darker elements. Now I'm just doing the same thing with the purple lake, and I'm using fan brushes, by the way, on that one. Now I am going to show you how you don't even have to have these acrylic inks. I'm using a dark Prismacolor pastel. It's called the spruce blue color. You could use any dark, and I'm adding water to it. You can see I get a similar effect, not quite as dark as the acrylic ink, so that's why I really like using that product. I'll be doing 2 5x7 paintings in my sketching journal, and I love using these pre-cut mats to go ahead and mark in my 5x7 area. I mean, why measure it out? It's pretty easy using these mats. The interior area is 5x7. The first reference image is some of the sunflowers from the beautiful day that I had. Like I said, I kind of wanted to journal this moment. My husband said, "Hey, look at that field over there." He was so sweet. He knew I'd probably take forever taking pictures, which I did. And he stopped and let me take this picture and many more. I got stung by a bee, but it was worth it. And now I'm getting in an easy, quick sketch, just using a pencil. I'm going to speed this up. You can't see it that well anyway. Just getting in a tree line. Remember the dark tree line I just created? I'm going to use that same technique to get in my darks. I also have some darks in the foreground and almost like a little pathway and some energy in the sky. So here we go. I'm going to use the indigo acrylic ink, and I'm going to use this little, it's kind of like a stiff bristle brush, and I liked how some of the ends of it were splayed out. So I'm just laying down some of this indigo color in the general area of the tree shape. I'm not worried about getting all those spaces between the tree branches. I'll show you my technique for achieving that later. We're just getting in basic shapes. And now another great thing about this acrylic ink is you think you have just one value. Well, you have tons of values because the more water you add, the lighter you can make it. So I get in my darkest darks first, and then I add a little more water to make this little trail or underneath pathway leading the viewer's eye through the painting, and add a little more water to get in some of the darker elements in the sky portion. A little bit lighter in some of the field in the distance because value gets lighter as it goes back further into the distance. And now it's time for watercolor. I'm getting out my little color chart again. And once again, I use this. I stress making one, even if a company doesn't provide one, because you can really determine the colors so much better. In the actual palette, the colors I'm using, they just look dark. You can't even tell. So I'm going to choose some cooler colors to lay down prior to beginning the pastel painting. I believe this color I chose is sky blue. I like to make a pretty concentrated puddle of it and sometimes use it directly from the palette to get my darkest areas. And I'm using this very similar to how I use the acrylic ink. I'm getting my darker values. It's just more paint to water ratio in my areas where my darkest values will be. And those are typically trees. Elements that are perpendicular to the landscape that stand up usually are darker, and foreground grasses where you have deep roots and things usually are darker. Foreground values are usually darker anyway. And real quickly, I want to share why I like using the acrylic ink and the watercolor to begin a pastel painting that is just on paper or surface like this. The reason is you get limited layers with soft pastel when you're working on surfaces that are just like paper, that aren't a professional sanded surface. Therefore, I know that I'm not going to be able to layer many colors of the soft pastel. And what happens when I use the acrylic ink and the watercolor is they don't take up any of the layering ability. It's like getting down 2 free layers of color before you add soft pastel. Now, many videos that I have, I would have used clear gesso to get a little texture to my surface. If you've watched my videos much, you see I just add a little clear gesso because it's clear. You can see the underpainting underneath, and it dries with a little bit of grit, kind of make a little sanded surface. But the goal of this lesson is painting on the go, taking a sketchbook and having limited supplies. So I'm not treating this surface after the watercolor with anything. and I'll be adding pastels directly to the surface. I'm just choosing a few of the colors here. And to reiterate, use whatever you have. It doesn't mean you have to go out and buy, more product if you already have something you can use. I actually love it on my Patreon page when you don't have the same colors, because it comes up with all these interesting combinations of colors and paintings that are unique in their own way. Towards the end of the painting, I do use a few softer pastels. If you can't get many layers with these Prismacolor NuPastels, they're a bit harder. If you have some soft pastels, you can usually get a little bit of extra layering and color punch to your painting. Now I've just got this pretty turquoisey color, and you see I'm just holding it lightly, using a really light touch. And what I'm focusing on is getting the energy and motion of these clouds, keeping it very dramatic and impressionistic. I think there's a freedom in learning the joy and the simplicity of impressionistic painting. There's a freedom in that we don't have to follow the photo exactly, but more we follow the energy, we follow the moment. And that's really a lot of what this pastel journaling and sketching is about. It's about capturing a moment that you had in life or where you were, even if you just take photos and come back to paint it. Now I've got a little bit of a darker value blue, and it's a little cooler. It doesn't have as much green in it as the turquoise. And again, just keeping this nice energy to things. Now I am going to speed this up a bit. And if you're a patron of mine on my Patreon page, it's at this point that you'll be getting extra commentary and the video won't be sped up quite so much. But not to worry, Monet Cafe, you get plenty of content here in this video as well. And hello, patrons. Welcome to your Patreon-only content. And right now I'm using the softer pastel I mentioned. I believe it's a Terry Ludwig pastel. I wanted to get in some lighter values. The source of light's kind of, I imagine it coming from the area right there where that left tree line is. And now I'm just getting in a little bit of a cooler and lighter value to suggest some of those trees further away, and even a little bit of a blue to have a third band of trees further away. It's all just very suggestive though. Now I'm using this pretty green, it's kind of a yellowy green, and putting it in the land. And look, yes, I'm putting it in the sky. Remember one of our recent story times talking about linking the sky and the land together? It's called echoing color, and often you can use some of the same colors that way. Now I'm gradually getting my greens a little bit darker in value as I move forward in the field, and my direction changes a little to more vertical strokes. I wanted to get a little warmth to these trees. Notice everything's very cool so far. So I'm adding a little bit of this magenta to the trees and in some of the deeper areas of the grasses. Now, remember what I said? My colors get warmer as I move forward, a little darker as I move forward, and a little more vertical. I'm putting some of that same green in the trees as well, and I'm using these scumbling marks, leaving a lot of the dark showing through. I don't want to cover it all up. I'm just suggesting some green on the trees. Here's my vertical strokes again. Before continuing, it's time for a very important step. I got to get me a sip of coffee. And now that I have a really light layer of some greens, by the way, it is important to layer lightly. We don't have any sanded surface here. This is just watercolor paper. I am going to work on the placement of some of these sunflowers. A strategy that I've used, I really like painting fields of sunflowers, but I've learned to place them by doing their centers rather than drawing the whole flower or shaping the whole flower. I just look at little general groupings of where the sunflowers are, keeping in mind that they're going to get smaller as they recede into the distance. And I'm using the photo as a general guide, not as a hard and fast rule that everything has to be exactly where it is in the photo. I, rather than copying the photo, just kind of use my artistic license, but I use the photo to get an idea of how the flowers are turned, trying to resist that common thing we do sometimes of making them all look the same, all facing forward. I'm trying to realize some of them are turned more to the side. Some of them are drooping down a little more. And so the photo helps me just to see some of the different shapes of these flowers. Now I'm getting in my darker kind of an orangey color. This is almost like a rusty orange, a little darker. And now I'm going to go in and add some of the lighter highlights on the petals. I'm just working on these flowers that are more in the front. And why would I do that? Well, if you're a patron of mine, you probably already know I talk about this all the time like a broken record. In soft pastel, we layer dark to light typically. We can put down a darker layer and add a lighter layer on top. Now we have to keep in mind with this watercolor paper, we're not going to get a lot of layering, so it limits you. I find, however, though, I love this type of painting because I have a tendency to work on a painting too long, and this type of painting doesn't allow for that. You kind of have to stop because, you know, I can't get any more layers if I layer more than 4 layers to this, and sometimes not even that. So it keeps your work very fresh, spontaneous, and underworked rather than overworked. I really love that. So now I'm adding some of this yellow, keeping it really suggestive, just a little areas where I sort of see where the flowers might be. They're often in these little clusters. And of course, I love to pop one way over the horizon line. There's a small one in the distance. You'll see me develop more as I work. Now I'm going in. This is a more of an orange color. I'm sorry, with my left hand, the way I'm working flat here, sometimes you can't see the painting surface all that well. So I've got some of my general shapes in, and now I'm going to start making a few of them a bit more pronounced and more as a focal point. I know that the underside of these sunflowers, that's where the darker petals are. That's why they're more orangey colored in the shadow, and their lighter petals are radiating towards the top and a little bit to the right there. I'm adding some cooler greens, not too light of a value in this area in the foreground, because this is where the deeper roots of the sunflowers are. If I put a really light green there, it would just not read right. So cooler colors usually in the shadows and a little bit of a darker value in the shadows. Now, as I move back, I'm gradually going to lighten up my greens. I'm making similar leaf shapes, but they're going to be smaller. They're not only lighter because they're further in the distance, they're smaller, they're receding prospectively into the distance. And I'm again using the photo as my guide. I know this is a little small here. I hope everyone can see good enough to see what I'm doing. Now I'm getting a little bit of that darker NuPastel. This is the spruce blue that they discontinued it. I don't know why. You can still buy it in or get it in the 96 set of Prismacolor NuPastels, but for some reason they don't sell it individually. But any dark pastel would work. Now I'm using the little NuPastel sticks. They work great for stems and for grasses. And now I grab this magenta color, and I feel that was the pop color. Usually in a painting towards the end, I want to have a color that just pops. And you know, I started with mostly cool, first monochromatic, and then a cool palette with the watercolor and some of the pastels I used to begin with. Then I have my warm colors and my sunflowers, but this magenta just added a little bit more warmth and color drama to the scene. Zoomed in a little bit more here so you could see some of the leaf shapes that I'm making. Very suggestive. Nothing needs to be overly detailed. And now I'm adding a little bit more of this pretty orange just to the tops of the sunflowers. And I am now getting at the tail end of my ability to layer. I'm getting pretty close to done. But you know, this little painting could be totally finished right now. This is a study and a way to paint that's spontaneous and a great way to paint while you're traveling. These Prismacolor NuPastels, by the way, they're not very dusty. They don't break very easily, so they're really great to take with you. So you could travel and just take a box of Prismacolor NuPastels, a watercolor sketchbook or a regular sketchbook, and paint on the go. Now I am developing the sky a little bit more. I'm going to add a little bit more of this teal blue. I'm leaving some lighter values, kind of the white of the paper even showing through a little bit, to suggest some of those clouds. But I am going to get my softer pastel here and use it to kind of blend some of these colors. Once you get a few layers down, you can use another pastel to blend. They start to blend together as you layer. I still have a lot of that cool turquoise color or bluish color I laid down originally when I began. So I'm adding some more greens to that distant field. And as I work here a bit, I wanted to share another thing that I really like about these pastel sketching journals. You know how you finish a painting and you've got to either frame it or store it or keep it safe. These are safe in your little journal. You just close them up, put a piece of tracing paper between it to protect it, and you often forget about these paintings if you haven't looked at your journal in a while. And it's this beautiful little memory, almost like sitting down with a family to look at photo albums. Often I go back and look at my paintings. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember the moment. And then I'm like really pleased to see what I painted. So I think if you try this, you'll enjoy that too. You can see I added a little more magenta, still playing around with some leaf shapes. And this painting could be totally done at this point, and often it is because I'm out away and I don't have any other supplies, but I'm in my studio making this. So I thought I'd show you. Now, pardon the lighting. I did something that caused my lighting to look too bright. The colors aren't as saturated right now. It gets better in just a minute. But I thought I'd show you that softer pastels really have the ability to layer a bit more. The harder Prismacolor NuPastels, they're great for working on unsanded paper, but you're limited in your layering. And you're still a little bit limited with really soft pastels, but you can get a few more layers if you have some soft pastels laying around. And this is a soft pastel brand that I love. It's called Sennelier. I believe it's their 40 half stick set. It's got some great colors for a little half stick set. So I'll try to include that link in the description of this video as well. So once the color corrects here, you'll be able to see that these pastels really added that additional pop of color that you're able to achieve with brands that are very soft, like the Sennelier brand. Now, it wouldn't be good to use this brand initially because they won't allow you to get many more layers. They're so soft, what happens is they fill up the tooth of the paper and you can maybe get 2 layers. So while they give the pop of color at the end, they're not best to use at the beginning, especially when working on an unsanded surface like this. All right, doing a little more blending in the sky. Again, sorry for my lighting messing up on the painting. You'll see the final at the end that's much brighter. I'm getting a little bit more darker value at the upper part of the sky. There, now you can see it's really vibrant in color. And this little painting is really close to done. The last thing, I did get a soft pastel that's a Terry Ludwig eggplant color. It's a dark, to pop in some of the centers of the sunflowers, just where I wanted more focal point. And now it's time for painting number 2. But first, I want to protect painting number 1 from smudging while I paint. And I'm using a piece of tracing paper. I'm just going to tape a little piece on top of this painting. Notice I started my painting first on the right side. I purposely did that because I'm left-handed. I wanted to be able to paint the second one without disturbing the first one with my hand. And by the way, if you get some pastels smudged around the perimeter of your pastel journaling, I have another little trick I'm going to show you at the end for cleaning up the pastels, basically erasing them off this paper. And now it's time to choose another reference image from the photos I took that beautiful day when my husband was so sweet and stopped and let me take photos of all of these flowers. And this is the one I chose. And by the way, if you're a patron of mine, you're going to get all of this content just sped up a little bit and some nice music. And on the regular Monet Cafe channel, though, this is going to be sped up quite a bit to keep the video a little bit short. So patrons, enjoy. I'm going to be doing the same techniques with this one, so you don't really need the commentary that much. But I am going to be doing a little bit of a different technique with the acrylic ink. This time, instead of using a brush, I happen to remember, I remember using something else with acrylic ink that worked really well. This is a sponge. Now, I live not far from an area called Tarpon Springs. It's a beautiful town, and it's on the water, and they're known as the sponge capital, or maybe of the world, I don't know, but there's natural sponges that grow in the water there. So you can just get bags of these sponges for a really good price. And I've just cut off a little piece here and I'm dipping it into the acrylic ink. And I'm going to use this to make my tree line. It makes some really interesting little shapes. It's a little bit different than using the fan brush, but I thought it was really fun. You know, the sky's the limit with art. You just get creative. Find what you have, make it work, and have fun. That's how I roll. So here I'm just basically getting a concept of the shapes of some of these trees. I find when you use like the sponge or even a fan brush, you tend to make marks and shapes that are more gestural. I know that there is kind of a dark area that's leading the groupings of these flowers into the landscape. So I'm giving a little hint of that dark trail that will be buried with grasses and flowers, but it still has that influence underneath. Now I'm using the sponge to get a little more grass shapes, and I did get the brush again to kind of give a little bit more shape to some of those trees. And I used the brush to get in some of the values in the sky. Once again, very similar to the same strategy as the first painting. However, I decided with this one to do something a little bit different when it comes to the watercolor temperature. I decided rather than going with a cool underpainting to do a warm underpainting. And I again apologize so much for whatever happened to the lighting. It does correct itself, especially at the end when I reveal both of the paintings, but something happened, made everything look a little bit washed out. Even my hands look a little weird, but I think you can still see pretty clearly what I'm doing. So I laid out colors in value, light like yellow, orange, and reds, and I just copied those. I should have put them in the other order on my palette. The lightest values in the distant grasses, oranges in the middle, and more of the reds in the deep roots. I even add a little bit to the sky. Remember how I talk about echoing color throughout the painting? It makes things feel connected. All right, the color's a little bit better now, and I'm going to speed this up just a little bit more. And again, patrons, you know, or I hope you know, that if you want to slow this down, all you have to do is watch it from the little, it's uploaded to YouTube, even when you see it on my Patreon page. And there's a little gear icon in the lower right corner that if you click it, you can set the speed to slower, so you can watch it slower. I will recommend turning the volume down though, because if I'm talking or if music is playing, it's going to sound very strange. Enjoy this, and towards the end, I'm also going to show you how I erase the little pastels around the paintings just to clean it up a bit. I'm also going to show you how I do some hand lettering. You know, when you journal, you want to sometimes write down the moment, you know, maybe give it a title, where you were, the date, who you were with, those kinds of things. All right, enjoy. I'll be back soon. here's the final for the second painting. And you see all the mess around it? Well, guess what you can do? You can get a kneaded eraser. It just looks like a little piece of putty. It's very affordable. And you can clean up the perimeter of your painting. It removes pastel quite well. I stretch it out and roll it around to get a clean spot to make a new erase mark. I now want to give it a bit of a caption. I'm using my Mogollon pigment liners. They come in different sizes. This is another affordable product. I'll have the description in the video. And I'm putting a piece of tracing paper over both paintings now because I'm one of those weird lefties. I turn my hand upside down to write, and you can't see what I'm writing because of that method of writing. But I wanted to just put in the date and just the moment. It was just a beautiful day with my husband, Todd. So I jotted that in, but I also want to go back and add where I was. It was Plant City, Florida, a really beautiful little town. And looky there, we have pastel paintings in a sketchbook. In this case, a watercolor sketchbook. And like I said before, I love having these. It's just such a nice way to store your work and your moments in life. I hope you learned a lot. If you're a patron of mine, I can't wait to see what you do with these. It's going to be fun. All right, guys, God bless and happy painting.